Lisette, welcome. It's a pleasure to have
Thanks.
you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I've been meaning to invite you on the podcast for so long. So now it was just one of those occasions where, my God, I have to invite Lisette. This is the right times. Like there's no one better to invite on this session than Lisette. So thank you for being here. Lisette is a worldwide recognized expert in remote work. She's managed many online communities in the early days of the internet. What did you use back then? What was IRC or something?
Yeah, I would say actually those would be the first communities. No, but I used private social networks. They were sort of all the rage about 10, 15 years ago. So instead of having a Facebook account, the companies would build their own private social networks, and they still exist. A whole bunch of membership organizations use them. But I spent years building those.
And of course, you learned a lot about working remote back then, right?
And community building online. Like how do you build a community online with people who have never met before? Because many of these organizations have global memberships and they simply can't get together.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, now with the COVID-19 situation, we actually ourselves, we have to start building our own online communities because it's not the same as being at the office.
No, for sure. Yeah. And thank goodness the technology rules today, and it's totally possible to
Like
do
we
it.
are having a meeting right now online and it's so simple.
Yeah, with people from all over the world. It's amazing. Yeah, it's not going to be good as in person, depending on what you're going for. Like it would be so cool to just be hanging out over a big pile of nachos and some beers with everybody. But but this is way better than nothing. Way better than nothing.
Especially because we are distributed. We are all over the world. And of course, now we can't travel, but even when we could, I mean, who wants to travel for 2 days to go and have a beer?
Yeah, exactly.
And now, for example, I'm working with a US-based client. Everybody's remote and we're having meetings all the time. And no one is worrying about traveling, right? Because now it's clear nobody can travel. But still, the work is getting done. So we're kind of like, getting used to this new reality as well.
Yeah, it's a forced start. Although this would not be the way I would recommend people go remote. You wouldn't take your whole organization overnight with no prep. I wouldn't do it that way. But here we are. Yeah.
It's not like we had a choice, right?
Right.
All right. So Lisette also wrote the Work Together Anywhere book and hosts regular Work Together Anywhere workshops, which are, of course, online, right?
Yeah, of
And
course. Yeah. If you're going to learn how
and
to work remote, you got to go remote. Yeah.
absolutely. But she also hosts other online meeting and facilitation master classes independently and with partners. Um,
Yeah.
you said that the book was written based on many interviews of remote workers. So let's start there. Like what might have been one of the most insightful aha moments that you had while you were you were interviewing people who had already been remote for a while and they were sharing their wisdom and experience with you?
I mean, well, that's a really good question. But I guess one of the things that I noticed was that there was a lot of people when I interviewed them that were way ahead of their time in terms of remote working. So we've been like virtual worlds, for example, have been around for over 20 years, but the adoption of virtual worlds has not taken off. Even though the power and everything that we can do in them is amazing, where people are training and conferences and military training and all kinds of things in virtual worlds. But in the general public, they're not taking off that much. So one of the things that really surprised me was the sophistication of the tools that are available, and in combination with sort of how difficult it is to get people to try these new ways of working. So how difficult it is to even get somebody into a virtual office just to see what that's even like. So that was one of the things that I really learned from the interviews, is that, whoa, there's a lot out there, and everybody is really busy in their own workflows as can be expected. But the technology is going way faster than humans can keep up in terms of work habits. So that's one thing that became clear.
And I'm guessing that through that experience and in those interviews, you also found out uh, who were the early adopters of this new trend, which you chronicled that in the book, and now we are all facing that in most of the world right now, facing the need to go remote. So, who were the early adopters, the people who really got started in pushing the boundaries of what's possible to do when you work in a distributed manner?
I mean, by far, software teams. And it seemed to be, and maybe it's because of the community that I'm in and that I worked with Management 3.0 so long, but it seemed to be specifically Agile software teams that were really starting to, because they're the ones who have to work remotely. They're not afraid of technology, and the continuous improvement component of them sort of drives teams to keep looking for solutions. So it was really distributed agile teams. But then in terms of industries, the one that surprised me the most was banks. Lots and lots of financial institutions are taking my workshop. And it was for years, I've been really wondering, like, what is it about banks that are doing it? And finally, I've sort of come to the conclusion is that fintech, there's a lot of small startups that are taking slivers away from the banking industry slowly, and the banks are starting to notice because it's cutting into their profits pretty significantly, and they're noticing that these smaller startups are starting to take pieces away, and they're finding the need to find new ways of working. So that one was super surprising.
One thing that might actually, push that even further is that the banks are, of course, because banks are discovering that they are corporations like any other corporation. And when they embrace tech, they do the same as other corporations do, which is they just buy startups, right? And they buy startups left and right in many countries all over the world because that's where they are. And they don't want to move to London to become a small department in a mega financial institution. They are very comfortable staying in Silicon Valley or Helsinki, Finland. There's quite a lot of financial startups here. And they are hiring, literally hiring many remote teams already, right?
Yeah, and what I've seen in the Netherlands with the banks here is that people are also consolidating real estate. So all of these big headquarters or all of these, like a bank will have several different headquarters in one city or several different buildings. And what they're doing is consolidating buildings to save money on real estate because real estate is a huge cost. But what they're doing in the consolidation is that not everybody they don't have room for everybody. So about 20% of the remote workforce, for example, has to work, or 20% of the workforce has to work remotely on any given day. So that is also a consideration. I think that's across all industries, is people trying to get rid of excess real estate or converting it.
Yeah, I remember already way back in 2008, Nokia, where I worked, they were already considering that only a percentage of their workforce would actually work from the office. And even those that work from the office, they would work in different offices in different days of the week. So they had what they called flex space. So space that was nondescript. It was just the same everywhere. And of course, that fostered remote work. We even developed a rule in my team at that time, which is when one is remote, everybody's remote. And that happened most of the time because, of course, the team was distributed all over the sites we had. So we needed to adapt to that reality.
Yeah, and I think most companies are adapting. And I've been saying, if you heard any talk of mine since 2015, I've said always, even if you don't allow for remote working, or if it doesn't make sense for your company, you should still have the processes in place to be able to go remote in case something happens. And the examples I always used were, sick kids at home, or the plumber that comes between 8 and 5. It never occurred to me that like a global deadly viral pandemic might be the one driving this. But here we are. Yeah, you should have listened in 2015.
So, of course, because of that, you've been flooded with requests, and you graciously accepted mine. So, thank you for that. To talk to everybody, and talk more about being remote, and people asking you questions. I'm sure there's quite a lot of interesting questions that you've been asked over the past 2 weeks. But after this major shift, what's the biggest question, the most recurring, the most perhaps the biggest challenge we are now facing as a society? What is the biggest question you get from those hundreds of people contacting you in the last 2 weeks?
There's a lot of people panicking about, well, here, their teams are suddenly overnight remote. And actually, I just spoke to, I don't know if he was the CEO, but he's a head honcho at a very, very large accounting firm today that called me. And the thing that they're having the most problems with, which is, it always surprised me, which is setting boundaries. That people are finding that they're working all the time now because your family is at home, and so you're mixing work and life, and that blend is just starting to go creep. There's no off time. So people are like, okay, an hour, the kids are on the iPad for an hour, I'm going to do a bit of work here, and then you get off and you have to feed them, and then they're off doing something else, you do a little pocket here, and then it turns out that it's 11 p.m. and you're still working in pockets of time. And so that is where actually people are struggling the most, is setting and keeping healthy work-life boundaries for themselves. And I have to be honest, I'm struggling with it myself. And I've been, I basically have lived quarantine for the last 5 years. I've got my home office. Unless I have to go somewhere for a conference or presentation, I'm here. Like, groceries are delivered home. Like, I don't have any reason to leave the house except for whatever I make up. However, I'm also still struggling with productivity and work-life balance because the situation we are in today is so extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if the reason why we are now facing this lack is that we actually used physical space as the excuse for the boundaries. And now that the physical space separation isn't there, we're not driving to work anymore, right? So
right.
Is that, in your perspective, what's happening, or why do you think that is happening now?
It's interesting. With this CEO guy today, he was saying, yeah, we were expecting that people, now that they don't have to commute, that they would use that time more for relaxing or with their family. And he said, that's not the case. We're using the commute time to actually work. So I believe what's happening is, the same amount of work is still there. We are all a little bit less productive at home because our systems, everything is sort of turned on its head. And our systems aren't good. So it's that time pockets that people are finding, and it just seems to creep later into the day and earlier into the day, later into the night and earlier into the day, depending on how we're working. So people are still trying to be as productive as they normally would be, but circumstances have changed, and we just shouldn't, we can't be as productive as we normally have been. Everything's different now.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one of the things regarding we can't be as productive is we have completely different structures. You've alluded to that, right? At home, we don't have potentially, I mean, some of us might have, but definitely not all of us have a separate office, right? You don't
right.
actually go into work. You're at work. You're you're on the work on the mobile phone, or you have to take the kids out because they're the whole day at home and they get antsy. So you need to give them some space to run and do whatever. And then you're in the mobile phone there, and then you get a call, and then you take it, and then you're working again. Like, what is the structure for, managing work life, let's call it balance, or merger, or whatever that might be, fusion, right? As Jürgen usually says. What structures have you seen work out there for people to be able to manage that difference between when you're really working and when you're not?
Number of different things that people have tried. One is, of course, setting time boundaries. So for instance, like I don't do workshops before 9 a.m. or after 9 p.m. So if I have to do something for New Zealand, I'll find another facilitator to actually do those workshops because I've made the agreement with my husband. So there's time boxing agreements. Some people are using separate devices. So, my laptop stays in my office. If I go, after I close my office door and go downstairs to work, I use an iPad to do anything electronic. So it's a totally different device than my work device. It doesn't have work emails. So you can separate that. A space separation is ideal. If you can go into a room and then close the door, and then that's the office. That's another thing. Some people what they're doing, if you don't have a space, you can still get dressed, walk out of the house, go for a walk around the block, and then come back and then that becomes your commute to work. And then of course, when you close down, you do the same thing. Some people actually do the walk the opposite way around to sort of close out the day in a different circle. So there's a number of different things that people can try. The problem with the boundaries and not working so much is that it's very specific to each person. Everybody has different needs in terms of how much and how late they can work and what their circumstances are. So what I would say is, you kind of know where to start if you're an individual. Like for me, I'm a workhorse. I just keep going. So for me, I really have to put those time boundaries. Like it's 9 p.m. No matter what happens, I have to just close my eyes and drop whatever I'm doing and walk out the room. So that's what works for me. But you really have to just try different things.
It's also about what you said about the walk or, entering a closed space, whatever that is. It's also about us setting our own rituals, right?
Yes. And in fact, we can segue into online meetings for this. One of the things that people struggle with in terms of online meetings is that usually if you're meeting in person, you have to walk to the conference room. And that walk to the conference room is your ritual for the meeting. So you stop for a cup of tea, you grab your stuff, you walk into the room, you get all settled, and then the meeting starts. But with online meetings, we push a button and we're there in the online world, unless you're using some horrible tool. But you're at a push of a button, you are suddenly in the meeting, and there is no meeting ritual necessarily. So that's really different.
And there's no toilet on the way from one button to the other.
Right. I think everybody's probably seen that horrible Slack meeting that went, or that horrible Zoom meeting that went awry. I couldn't even watch it. I thought, because I have bathroom shyness. I mean, I can't even imagine. I couldn't watch the full video. I already knew what happened. So yeah, be careful.
But it's something that happens in real life and you can't reproduce in virtual worlds, right? Or in online, because you're sitting in the same place. You just alt tab into a new window or just click a button and you're there.
Right. And rituals are thrown out the window at that point. And actually it turns out rituals are very important.
Okay, so we'll probably talk about rituals soon. Arlo has a question. He says it's a naive, provocative question. Anyway, he says, as a technical manager, I'm doing a lot at the moment on Slack through writing, sharing status, asking questions, sharing feedback, launching asynchronous discussions. Why and in what circumstances do you advise we set up online meetings?
Yeah, so it's actually a really good question. So it's like, why do you even need a meeting? So I always say for meetings, you want to set them up when things get emotional. You do not want to do asynchronous emotional talking. It's just not advised. So you don't fight via text message, or instant message. And the other is for decision making and discussions is really like when you really need to have an in-depth discussion that needs to go faster with people. So for any time, anytime it's emotional, anytime a discussion needs to happen, or decision making needs to happen. And you can also do decision making remotely, but it can really help to get that discussion online.
So one thing I would add, I would like to hear your opinion. There's something that we do as facilitators very often, which is to help people come up with ideas and eventually come up with a decision, but to come up with ideas. So brainstorming, right? So that seems to me that's an action that benefits from direct interaction, like brainstorming, creative thinking in groups, right? Not me creating a solution for the problem I have, but rather we working together for creating a common shared solution. What do you think about that?
So one thing that's really different about in-person and online meetings or these kind of things is the types of things that we should be doing in online meetings are different than what we can do in in-person meetings. So for example, if I go to an in-person meeting, somebody can give a 30-minute presentation and it's pretty interesting and you can interrupt and all these things. If I come to an online meeting and somebody gives me a 30-minute presentation, it's not really a great use of time. For example, it's boring online. Usually it's pretty boring unless you have some sort of really fun interactive stuff, but generally 30 minutes of just, who doesn't multitask in a webinar? Everybody does it. It's the same with online meetings. So I would say you'd want to do your record the presentation beforehand, send it out to people so that they can prepare for the meeting, and then use your meetings for discussions and decision making. But like that prep time, there's a bunch of asynchronous stuff that you should be doing before the meeting actually starts, and then use that online time for decision making and discussions. And remind me again the question, because I had another point that I just.
Yeah. So the question is, I spend a lot of time writing, so Slack, sharing status, asking, sharing feedback, launching asynchronous discussions. Why and in what circumstances should I set up online meetings?
Yeah, but there was another one that you had mentioned after that, which is like, what can you do online? Oh, brainstorming and decision making.
Brainstorming, yeah.
Yeah, so the brainstorming thing that I wanted to say is, you can do the brainstorming online, of course, with a number of different whiteboarding tools or Retrium or all these kind of things. But what you want to make sure is that you don't introduce group think. So if everybody can see what everybody else is posting, you all of a sudden get groupthink. So what you want to do is use some sort of if you're going to brainstorm online, have people post ideas that can't be seen by everybody else until you get together online. One example, like for instance with Retrium, everybody can add ideas onto the sticky note board, and then when you get it, but nobody else can see anybody else's ideas. So then you get the facilitator online, they push the button, and then everybody's ideas become clear. And that way you prevent group think and you get each individual coming in.
Yeah, more
so I would
creativity, yeah.
For sure, yeah. So you want to think individually and then discuss as a group. So you want to bring your individual ideas to the table, but then discuss as a group. When you're in person, you can be a little bit sloppier about these things, because people can just shoot ideas off. But online, it tends to be a little different.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I would like to perhaps explore a little bit further, which is the concrete, explicit differences between online and offline. And actually, Peter just posted a question on Slack about that, which is, how do you prepare for an online meeting? How does that preparation differ from your usual meetings, which were, of course, before COVID-19, mostly co-located? So what are the key differences in your mind between preparing for an online versus co-located meeting, Lisette?
Well, one is you've got to really plan out what can you do asynchronously versus what can you do only when you're together. And so just like I said, in terms of preparation, the presentations that you give, having people come with their ideas. With online meetings, the preparation is going to take more time than the actual meeting in general. The other thing that you want to be clear about with online, and in fact, all of this applies to all meetings in general, right? Because a good online meeting starts with a good meeting, which means that you want to start and end on time, and you want to have an agenda. And you want to have an agenda that's visible to everybody so people know what's going on. But in terms of the prep time, you really want to structure the meeting as, does it have a clear purpose? Does everybody know why they specifically were invited? So for instance, if I'm going to set up an online meeting, I might say, okay, Vasco, I'm inviting you because you have knowledge about this specific expertise and I need your input on that. So when I worked at Management 3.0, we actually had a rule that said, you can call a meeting, but you have to convince people that meeting is worth coming to. And that actually was a really good strategy, because I had to then go out and say, I really need you to come to this meeting because this input is really important. So instead, we tend to schedule a whole bunch of meetings, and then you just spend your whole day online. The other thing to think about when you're structuring online meetings is don't go too long without taking a break, because staring at the screen for long periods of time causes virtual fatigue. So I would say if you're going to have a meeting that's longer than 45 minutes, 45 minutes for an online meeting should be kind of your cutoff. If it's longer than 45 minutes, at least a 5-minute break after every 45 minutes. And if it's going longer, for instance, I've done 4-hour workshops online before. I don't like those. I think it's too long, but I have a partner that likes them. And we do 2 10-minute breaks plus 1 20-minute break during that 4-hour session, because you just can't focus into the screen that long. It's not healthy. There's something different about meeting online and then working at your laptop. There's a different type of focus. So yeah, that structure. So the prep, needs to be different, and then the length of time that you can meet online needs to be different. And then interactivity. You've got to build in interactivity into your online discussions, so polls and Q&As and virtual whiteboards and something where you can visualize things together.
Yeah, so good thing you talked about interactivity. So everybody, I'm publishing a poll right now. The poll is now live. You can check it. It's probably flashing on your Zoom interface. The question is, what is the hardest Scrum ceremony to facilitate online? And there's different options. Of course, there's all the Scrum options, and there's one which is not a Scrum meeting, but some other meeting. So please do enter your answer to that, and with Lisette, we'll share some tips on how we might want to focus on preparing for those specifically hardest ceremonies that we have to handle as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, and of course as team members as well, because don't forget, it's as much of being a participant as it is of being a facilitator. We need to take those perspectives into account. Another interactive, say, short break here. You are on Slack, so please do enter questions, comments, maybe something I'm asking or Lisette is mentioning you want a little bit more clarity. Just put that on Slack so that we can for sure focus on that topic specifically if it isn't clear or if it requires a little bit more time. All right, Lisette, going on to the next question. You've built many companies in, those private social networks that you were talking about. You've built many communities for those companies you worked for before you started working in your current business. When you think about the work you did with distributed communities and now what you can learn from that you can apply to our reality right now of going remote in a hurry and rapidly, what is perhaps the biggest lesson you take from that remote community or distributed community building that we can use to our benefit right now, as we are now, forced to be a distributed online community?
One weird thing about online communities that people don't realize is that you're interacting asynchronously entirely online. So there's no video in terms of these online communities, which we have now. But one thing that really mattered, that was interesting, was that instead of using avatars, cartoon avatars or picture avatars, it was better that people actually used pictures of their real faces to represent them. So for instance, in Slack, when you have a picture of your face, it helps the connection of your teammates to actually see your face in that community instead of an avatar. And it sounds a bit silly, but it does increase the humanness that's online. So one of the tips that I always give is use your real picture of your face wherever you can in terms of your work communities or your online communities. And then with remote meetings, turn the videos on. Like that is the number one tip. And I know people hate turning their videos on and there's all kinds of excuses. However, I have polled now thousands of people throughout all the presentations that I've given. And the number one reason that people are not turning their videos on is because they're multitasking and they don't want people to know. That's has been the number one reason that people, and it's an anonymous poll, so I have no reason to believe that people are faking their answers. So, but what I've noticed is that sense of team really is the visual aspect is hugely important for that. So whatever you can do to bring a visual aspect to your online community, whether it's turning on your video or putting your face as your avatar, that is hugely important for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It also, if we think about it from a facilitator's perspective, it gives you information that you would otherwise not have access to during a meeting, right? Because you can see whether people are checking out, but you can also see if they are being interrupted, right? And that is a very important factor. The other aspect is that you can sense emotions from
Exactly.
body movement and body language.
Exactly. I mean, you see somebody sitting like this, you know exactly what they're feeling,
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, or like rubbing their eyes or, it's just that people always say, oh, you can't really sense the room online. And I would say, actually, you can sense a lot of things online, just like you can do in the room. You know, we can see, we can hear things, we can, you know, are people taking notes? There's a lot that we have within these 4 virtual walls that gives us an incredible amount of sensory information.
Yeah, absolutely. This aspect of going remote, of course, brings the need to transition towards remote. And in your book, you actually have a whole chapter transitioning towards the remote option. What is perhaps one of the lessons you talk about in the book that would be extremely helpful for us right now as we are transitioning towards the remote option?
Don't do it overnight, but okay, here we are. That's like tip number 1 in the book is like, take it slow and don't do it. Don't go remote overnight. Oh God, it's been like one of the bigger tips. But one thing I would say for managers and team leads right now, the biggest thing I think is to be very kind and patient with people, because it is so disruptive to be taken out of your normal routine and your normal workspace, and just the stress of having this weird invisible enemy out there that nobody can see or feel or touch, is extremely stressful for people. So one, be kind and patient with your team, and really I would say do more check-ins at the moment just to see how people are doing, like how you're doing. And the other is get them the right equipment, because okay, it's great for a week. Now it's been 2 weeks. We're kind of in week number 3 now in some countries that people haven't been going into the office. So like week 1, it's okay to have your makeshift desk and your makeshift stuff. But by week 3, it gets a little bit old and you want to start to get yourself some real equipment. So it looks like this is going to be happening for the next couple of months. I mean, it looks like 8 to 12 weeks as people are on lockdown. And I would say if you're going to go that long, if you're a manager or you're a leader, get your team a decent headset, a decent webcam, maybe a green screen that they can use if they need to hide their background and they want to use a virtual background. But ask your team, what infrastructure do they need in order to get their work done? And then I would also invest in training people how to use the tools. So when I interviewed NASA, they said that they assigned a support person to every scientist that comes on board, because scientists are really good at being scientists, but they're not really good at being technical people. So, they actually train their scientists one-on-one at NASA. And yet I talked to the support team and they said, yeah, it's a massive thing, but okay. On the other hand, once the scientists are up and running, it's all good. And they've had one-on-one support. So there's a lot of people out there working who are too embarrassed to say anything about their lack of knowledge on the tools. And I would say as a leader, be helpful in that way and get people the training that they need, because we are now going to be doing this for months, it looks like.
And
so
if we play the movie a little bit forward, it's quite clear that many of us will prefer to work this way after this crisis is over, and we will be looking for opportunities to work this way. So companies have a choice of either offering that opportunity or not, and then of course losing key talent, because people do, now that they are forced to experiment, people do change their perspective, right? Some people that might have been staunch remote work opponents, right? And I know many in the Agile community who still say, even today, the only way to do distributed Agile is not to do it, right? And
yeah.
You and I know that actually, I know very few Agile teams that don't have at least one or potentially more team members who are remote.
Yeah, the reality of the situation is we have distributed Agile teams. And so I don't want to argue, are they better or worse? And I'm like, it's a reality. So then what? Like, okay, maybe it's better to be in the same room together, but who has that? Like, it's very rare. Like, great if you can do it, but if you can't, like, then what? So I'm much more interested in the then what argument, because I think the reality is we have to do it.
And my own experience, having worked in large, small, and medium-sized companies, is that many teams have some members distributed, and some teams are fully distributed. So we do need to take that into account, which leads us to the meetings question. Of course, we've already talked a little bit about this, but we did a survey 2 weeks ago, and one of the things that Scrum Masters and Agile coaches shared with us was that they are not ready to facilitate remote meetings. And of course, that's one of the things we are struggling with right now. Yesterday, we had Katya Zarina on this live Q&A, and she was talking about how they had to pivot from a face-to-face big room planning event into a remote planning event with the same people, but now they couldn't travel because they had that just after the travel ban came into place. And of course, at that time, they had to pivot. She was referring to it being a Sunday. She gets the message, no one is traveling tomorrow. How can we do this remote, right? So we need to get our act together and start adapting to this need to facilitate remote meetings. So we're going to talk about tools, practices, simple tricks that people can use. But let's start with the ceremony that most people reply to on the poll is the hardest to facilitate online, and that's the retrospective. Now, I know you have been talking about remote retrospectives, and you've been hosting your own remote retrospectives with the teams that you have been working with. So what can you share with us about helping us get ready and facilitate great distributed retrospectives?
So with retrospectives, I'm biased towards a particular tool because I've just had so much success with it. And that is because I love Retrium. I mean, there's many retrospectives tools out there. Many are very good, but in particular, what I like about Retrium and actually what I think is important about conducting remote retrospectives is what we discussed in the beginning, that everybody bring their ideas to the table individually without seeing what everybody else's ideas are. And I think Retrium does that really well. And then the other is to be able to vote on those topics anonymously. So, what do you talk about first? How do you vote on those things? And Retrium gives a really nice way of voting on topics so that you can prioritize which things you want to talk about. In terms of facilitating retrospectives, the one thing that I would say about an online facilitator is to be able to make sure that everybody is able to be seen and heard. So there's quiet people in the group, and as a facilitator, you want to be able to bring out the people who are not speaking and also have them be heard. So when we're all online, it equalizes things a little bit, but it's now up to the facilitator to be able to call on people and say like, hey, Silvana, I haven't heard from you in a while. Like, what do you have to say? Or, so just to make sure. And in fact, some facilitators, Judy and I have seen, Judy Reese is somebody that we created the remote meetings masterclass together. And it was an experiment that gone wild. But what we've seen people do is write down the people that are in your meeting. And then every time somebody speaks, you put a tick next to their name. And then you can see, oh, there's somebody that's like speaking a lot. And oh, there's people that are speaking very little. So then you can actually go through and just visually see who's been speaking. So remote retro, they're not, it's not that different from from other kinds of meetings, except for you have to, one, have the right tools and the right facilitation in place. So make sure everybody can be seen and heard, make sure that everybody's ideas are brought to the table individually, and so that and then brainstorm together. And of course, take action on the outcomes of the retrospective. That's probably the number one thing. But a lot of these things are good for in-person versus remote. It's just that remote, it's critical, and in-person, we can be a little bit sloppier.
So that's true, because there's a lot more room for improvisation when in person, right? Like if a Post-it drops on the floor when you're putting them on the whiteboard, you just pick them up. But if the electronic tool where you're planning to write stuff up just stops working, then uh-oh.
Right. Or, yesterday we had a nationwide internet outage with T-Mobile. So, and then I'm facilitating a meeting of 25 people. What do you do? Then what? Like, there's all kinds of technical challenges when going online. So then...
So what's your tip for internet access? What do you do?
Always have a backup plan. I have a mobile router that I can use from a different internet provider. And then what I ended up doing, it worked really great, is I logged in through my phone. I put a hotspot on my phone, started up Zoom, and it worked shockingly well.
So I have done the same for many years now. I always carry with me two different internet providers, so one on the phone and one on the mobile router. And of course, when at home, I have the fixed internet. So that's definitely a tip. Always have a backup. I have been recording podcasts for 5.5 years now. So the first thing I learned as I started recording podcasts was that always have a backup internet.
Yeah, I mean, very seriously, they have that funny cartoon with the hierarchy of needs, and on the bottom of a team's hierarchy of needs is good Wi-Fi. And I've always said that to people: is if you don't have good Wi-Fi, you are doomed, because we have to connect online. We need Wi-Fi. So if you're a leader and one of your team members does not have good Wi-Fi at home, do not skimp money there. Get the best possible, because
Yeah,
you're gonna need all the bandwidth.
absolutely. Which right now, because we are transitioning rapidly to remote, that's one of the things I would recommend everybody does right away, which is to get a second internet provider. So either expand the bandwidth on your phone and the data plan on your phone, or get a second Wi-Fi provider. A second internet provider at home if you can. Right? It might not always be possible. All right. So we got two questions. One comes from Nadisha. She's talking about how to keep everybody attentive during the meetings, the online meetings. She says, we have a sprint meeting with the architect, and not everyone is talking except one person who always has, or who actually has, the questions to ask the architect. Now, not everyone needs to speak, but in general, the attentiveness of people who are not speaking is, of course, not as good. Attentiveness is generally better on a physical meeting. What do you have, Lisette, to either keep people attentive or somehow facilitate the meeting so that people don't check out?
So one of the things that I've learned from working with Judy is a quote by Nancy Klein, and then an activity that shows just how distracting it can be when you don't have active attention in a meeting. And the quote is, the quality of your attention can determine the quality of another person's thoughts. So the idea is that if I'm really listening to you, then it allows you to really think. So, and it's really important. So, in an online meeting, when people's attention are there, then the person who's speaking is motivated to think better. And one of the exercises that we do is we break everybody out into pairs. One person will start talking about anything. It could be your pets, something engaging, something you can talk about for a minute. And they'll talk for about 30 seconds. And then the instruction to the listener is, after 30 seconds, distract yourself. Put up your phone, like walk away, turn your back on the person, and see what happens to the conversation when you do that. And of course, we know the conversation derails because the person speaking can't continue to speak when they've seen the other person is distracted. So that exercise alone really just shows viscerally for the team how important active attention really is, and how distracting it is for others on the call when we're not paying attention. So that's an exercise that I do. It takes like 2 minutes. Everybody gets a chance, but it really hits home for people, like, if I'm not giving my full attention, the thinker is not giving their full thoughts. So I usually do that exercise to sort of highlight the importance.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I have had experience with as a Scrum Master and Agile coach facilitating online meetings is to regularly check in with the participants if they have understood what is being discussed, especially just before a decision is being made, right? So, okay, so could you guys repeat what do you think of this idea? Could you repeat it in your own words, something like that, just to make sure that people are really paying attention. If I don't ask questions from people, they don't pay attention. And you've heard this. I'm sure that everybody has seen this. When somebody's called out, like in a conversation, and we say, "What do you think, Jeff?" And then Jeff takes a while to respond, and then comes in and says, "Oh, I was on mute," right? And when people say that, okay, sometimes they were on mute, and we can see that on Zoom, by the way. But actually, very often, they just weren't paying attention, right? Because the phrase that comes after is, "Oh, I was on mute. Could you repeat the question again?"
Right.
Right.
So, they just heard their name, like, oh no, I'm being called out.
So
Indeed.
That's a tip. Call their names out.
Well, and also you can also, what Judy and I, there's lots of ways of asking for feedback online. One way is like just using the 5 hands, right? Like on a scale of 1 to 5, show me how you're feeling right now. 5 is like, woohoo, let's get this party started. And 1's like, I should never have gotten out of bed. And you can immediately just get feedback from people, in a very visual way using your body. You can get feedback using polls. You can get feedback. One of the things that Judy and I will do is say, in 1 word, tell me what you think about that last section. And so somebody, will go around and everybody like inspiring, boring, unnecessary. So another way to re-engage people like that. And then I would say if you have big meetings, use breakout rooms, because otherwise you might as well just be doing a webinar. So anything over like 6 people or so, I would start using breakout rooms in order to facilitate discussions.
So one thing that works really well for me is to engage people through the chat infrastructure that we might have. So everybody, we're now using Slack. So I want you guys to give me from 1 to 5, how valuable have the tips been so far, where 5 is very,
it's
very
so
valuable.
Confronting.
And 1, I would rather be in another online meeting. So, okay, go on. 1 to 5.
And you want to put them in a Slack, okay?
Slack, okay. Yes, everybody, come on.
Be brutal, I can take it. I've had lots of 1s in my life, so plenty of hair on this chest. Okay, so far so good.
Okay,
I always
4,
sweat.
4, 5. That's great. Arlo, Juan, Shubhang, Nadisha.
All the nice people are answering
Peter,
first. Thank
Collins.
You.
Oh,
thanks,
by the
guys.
way, those are the, can you show those cards, by the way, the super online cards? Can you show them?
Yeah, they're my virtual meeting cards, because of course there's somebody, if you're on mute, then you can just show that you're on mute, or you can show like, hey, you're frozen, or of course when the doorbell rings, especially now, like, oh, I'll be right back, so that people just know like, oh, I'll be right back. Or you can express your, like, I love the love card. So I've got a whole bunch of them. I've got a whole deck, so you can find them on the website. But one tip that I'll give to people is what I've done is I've got this, I'm a big board game fan, so I got this little card holder to hold all my cards next to my laptop. So they're easy access right next to my laptop.
All right, so next question comes from Arlo. I've got 3 squads to support / manage that interact a lot between them. So 3 squads that need to interact among themselves. Should I consider creating 3 breakout video rooms during the day? And if yes, what should I take care of? Optional, mandatory, limited to 1 hour? Like, how do I manage 3 different rooms during the day? And they are all remote, of course.
So there's 3 squads to manage and support. Oh, wow. I wouldn't even do breakout rooms. I might even just put them in their own Zoom room, just assign them their own Zoom rooms, and then go visit them when needed. Or otherwise you're sitting sort of alone in your own space, and then you go to different breakout rooms. But I would say, because you as a facilitator have to manage the breakout room. So I would give them their own Zoom rooms. You could even create like a little wiki of different Zoom rooms, and then you can go in as a manager and just go visit, I would say. So it sounds like they're using these video rooms to just be together and work. Is that correct, Arlo?
At the moment, they are using only Slack and written communication, but I'm not comfortable with breakout room at the moment. But I was wondering if I had to suggest them to have a video room for each of them where they can pop in, pop out during the day.
I would suggest it not, and I wouldn't. There's a tool called Video Facilitator that I would suggest checking out, because what that allows people to do is put themselves in their own rooms, their own breakout rooms, so they control everything themselves. But this situation sounds like a perfect situation for a virtual office. So something like Sakoko or Remo or Walkabout Workplace, where people can actually go in and see what you do is you see what's on, you can see where everybody is on a virtual floor plan. It has different offices. And if you want to go talk to somebody, you just double click on their office and you go into their office and talk to them virtually. So I would say check out Sakoko. I'll put it in the live Q&A. Sakoko or Remo, or I've got a whole list of virtual office tools I can send out actually. For people. But what you're talking about, I wouldn't use Zoom for that. I would use a virtual office. Way more powerful.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, so there's one which I'm sure you've heard many times. This one is about excuses. This question comes from Sharna, and she says, "What if video on limits the bandwidth for audio, i.e., makes the audio difficult? This is being used very often as a justification for not turning the video on. As a Scrum Master, how do I work around this? How do I tackle that objection in teams, especially in teams that are struggling with collaboration and trust?"
One thing that I would, bandwidth is an issue in some areas for sure. And in video, that's why I'm saying, one, get really good internet for your team, wherever whatever you got to pay to get them a good line, get them a good line. The other thing that I would say is, you don't have to have video on for the entire meeting. Even just turning the video on for the first 5 minutes to say hello and the last 5 minutes to say goodbye, even that is way better than keeping video off for the entirety of the meeting. So I'd say if bandwidth is a problem, do that. Do the first and last 5 minutes just so that people can see each other. Or maybe if they're speaking, turn on the video if possible. Yeah, it depends on the tool that you're using. Some tools require more bandwidth than others, of course, but in that case, if you don't have good internet, you're really in a difficult situation in terms of how to work online. It really is the baseline of Maslow's hierarchy of needs of working online. It really is. It limits. If you can't do video, then you can't do virtual offices. You can't do, you can't do a number of things if your bandwidth is low. You basically are limited to asynchronous communication, and asynchronous is great, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
Not if you want team building and camaraderie. You would have to have a very special team that could bond completely asynchronously.
Yeah, and it is possible. It's just going to take a while to develop, and the methods, the rituals, and so on. So if you're going remote in a hurry, then that's not really the best option. Okay, so we have one more question coming from Juan. And Juan asks, I have a team with a mix of Eastern and Western cultures, about 50-50 split. Eastern team members seem not to voice their concerns or questions until after the meeting, and when no one is present, and where Western team members tend to do the opposite, i.e. voice their concern and questions during the meeting. How do you find a balance between the two so that they are all heard?
It's so difficult with cultures. The way that I solve this on my teams, but it's difficult. There's a couple of ways to do it. One is creating a team agreement where you actually explicitly discuss this with the team. That's not going to create a comfort level with the Eastern team members, I would say, but it at least gets the issue out in the open, and ask the team like how to solve this. The other thing is maybe they could send their questions via like video, so it's not maybe it's not live in the meeting, but maybe they're more comfortable afterwards stating their question on video, or making a Loom recording or something, you just share your screen and a little video of what you're doing. Maybe the questions can come up that way, or reduce the size of the group so that they don't feel so intimidated by having to say their question into a larger group. But in terms of culture, you're not going to get rid of the cultural, nor should you get rid of the cultural differences. They're extremely important on the team. You don't want everybody acting one way, for sure not. But I would say is one, have a discussion about your team agreement on how you want to do it, and then look for ways. Maybe what can happen is that the questions and concerns come asynchronously from everybody. So from the Western and the Eastern, or maybe reverse the roles and say like, hey, we're trying a new thing today. The Western team, you have to submit your questions asynchronously. The Eastern team, we'd like you to submit them this here for now. Like just do an experiment and see what works. But I would really call on the team, like call it out to the team, and then ask the team, how would you guys solve this? Because it's clearly an issue.
All right, so last question from the audience, and then we need to close off because we're getting to the end of the hour. Which would you suggest as a good whiteboarding tool for virtual meetings? This question comes from Srinath.
So let's say there are tons and tons of different tools for whiteboarding, and I'll post this in the chat of here, because I've already posted tools in the Slack channel. The two hot whiteboarding tools on the market today are Miro and Mural. So M-I-R-O or M-U-R-A-L. Miro or Mural. Those are sort of the two hot ones on the market. However, one that I'm really liking right now is just Google Jamboards. And it's super simple, but that's exactly what you want, is you don't want the tool to get in the way of the brainstorming. And with Google Jamboards, I've used it now for workshops for the last 2 months, I think. No problems at all with getting people how to learn it. I've got people drawing and adding sticky notes within 2 minutes of them entering the tool. They'll start with like, how do I? And by the time they finish their sentence, they've already figured out how they were going to do whatever they were going to ask. So for me, Google Jamboard, super powerful, super easy to use, accessible to almost anybody. If not, I would try Miro or Mural. And then the other one that people really like is Web Whiteboard. That one seems to be getting a lot of good attention as well. But I've posted a whole link to brainstorming tools. Try a few of them out. It just depends on what you're looking for.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining this. I have one last question. Lisette, your company is called Collaboration Superpowers. And of course, believe me, everyone on this call would love to have those superpowers right now.
Me included.
So what is the one superpower, the one thing we can start doing to help our teams collaborate when remote? The one thing.
Turn your videos on. Convince people to turn their videos on.
There you go.
Number one.
There you go. You've got it from Lisette. Turn your videos on. All right, everybody. Thank you very much, Lisette. It's been a pleasure. So thank you very much once again for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thanks for inviting me, Vasco. And thanks for all the questions, guys and girls.